talk to Bruce Rubenstein.
Oh God.
Well, I mean, it's a fair question.
I think I'm getting defamed.
No. Truth is a defense. I mean, you've been talking about all your great 60s connections.
Oh gosh.
All right, folks, it's 7 o'clock, so we should
Yeah, clean it up.
Yeah. All right.
wait a couple of more minutes. We're still waiting on our speakers to join us, and then we will.
All right. Well, in that case, I'll tell you that my daughter has decided to become a college professor.
Well, you're gonna have two professors on tonight. She should phone in and watch.
What does she want to teach?
I mean, you know, I'm thinking it's probably going to be in political thought and theory. She was.
We'll wait one more minute to get this meeting started, and then we'll kick things off. All right, I'd like to call this meeting of the City of Hartford Charter Revision Commission to order at 7:03 p.m. And we will begin with the roll call, and I will pass it over to David Grant.
Okay, great. So when I call your name, just please say here. And, you know, for reference, if you can just keep your phones on mute to reduce background noise, that'd be great. So James Wolfe.
Here.
Raul De Jesus Jr.
Here.
John Gale.
Here.
Alexander Aponte. Arunan Arulampalam. Steve Bonafonte.
Here.
Vicki Gallen Clark.
Here.
Kamora Harrington. Kenneth Kennedy.
Here.
Kathleen Kowalshin. Melvin Medina.
Here.
Yadira Rivera.
Here.
Bruce Rubenstein.
Here.
And Eon Smith.
Here.
And you have a quorum.
Wonderful. All right, so if you all took a look at the agenda this evening, you'll have seen that we don't have an agenda item allowing us to approve the minutes. So without an objection, I'd like to add an agenda to the item to the agenda that will allow us to approve the October 7th meeting minutes from that meeting. Are there any objections?
Seconded.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor of approving the minutes from the October 7th meeting of the Charter Revision Commission, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it and the motion carries. Okay, great. We have a panel discussion this evening. And we're going to be having Dr. Sally Nuama from Northwestern University and Dr. Jonathan Collins from Brown University. We are working on getting them the Zoom link for the meeting, and they should be on momentarily. Before we have that panel discussion, though, I did want to talk about going back to meeting in person. Mask mandates have been lifted in some surrounding towns. Numbers are down as far as positive cases. So I would like to propose, getting back together in person. Actually, we haven't been together in person. So getting together in person at our next meeting, which would be, I believe it's November 4th. Does anyone have any strong feelings about that, concerns?
Nope.
Okay.
Will they be hybrid or will it be a live meeting?
That's a good question. Ideally, it would be hybrid. We may have to do live depending upon technology, but David and I will take a look into that and we'll, correspond with the commission before making an ultimate decision on that.
While the mask mandates have been lifted, are we still going to be distancing ourselves and appropriately while at these meetings? I understand the mask mandates have been lifted, but just so you aware, I have a 5-month-old, so I still wear a mask, and I don't, I try to avoid congregating because she hasn't gotten a shot, and I don't know what's going to happen with this situation. So I'm super cautious even when I'm in the office. I wear a mask, and my colleagues respect me and respect that, and they wear a mask even though we're all vaccinated. So that would be my only concern, that I don't want to sort of sit there with a mask on while everyone else doesn't have a mask, and people are thinking that, whatever you may be thinking about that. So I just want to make sure that I make that clear.
I think that's a very valid concern. Yes, Commissioner Kennedy.
Why don't you, there should be, if people have valid reasons, as the commissioner does, Commissioner Smith's got a very valid reason. Maybe he should be allowed in through, from, and in my office, we rotate who has to come in the office and who doesn't, and who works from home. Maybe you can come up with that kind of system as well, so that there is an in-person aspect to the meeting, but allow some people to participate for valid reasons from their residents. And obviously, a man with a 5-month-old who has my deepest sympathy, I've been there, just in terms of time and energy. Having him participate, I think that's fine. And the rest of us can certainly be there. I'm getting my 3rd vaccine shot tomorrow, so I coming from at a wedding, and I'm scared to death of having that many people together.
Yeah. No, I think that's I think it's a very valid concern, Commissioner Smith, and Commissioner Kennedy has a good point. So I'll speak with David if we can, if there's a way that we can do hybrid meetings and do it effectively, we can certainly do that. And then with regards to, for the folks that are there in person, we have the option of using the function room and the council chambers as well. Council chambers is outfitted with some plexiglass barriers and has a little bit more room. So we have that option as well. So stay tuned. We'll provide more details on that, but just wanted to give everyone a heads up. And one of the other things, and I know we have our professors here, so I'll wrap this up quickly. But I just wanted to mention too that we do have the ability to now meet out in the community as well. So if folks have ideas about places in the community that we could meet, open to ideas there. And if anyone has issues with meeting in a church or a place of worship, let us know about that as well. All right, and with that, are there any other comments or questions in regards to that? Okay, great. All right, so we'll now switch to item number 2, the panel discussion regarding public engagement and participation models for boards of education. As I mentioned, we have Dr. Sally Nuama, the Assistant Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern University. And we also have Dr. Jonathan Collins, the Assistant Professor of Education, Political Science, and International and Public Affairs from Brown University, joining us this evening. And before we start with Dr. Nuama, I just wanted, Steve, if you can provide a little background for, the idea behind putting this panel together and what to expect, that'd be helpful.
Thank you, and I want to thank the 2 professors for joining us. As we were preparing for this review of the Board of Education, one of the major issues that we have been discussing is the issue of public participation, public engagement, finding ways and means for government to reach out and make sure that particularly the Board of Education is somehow connecting with the residents of our community, the parents and the students and other residents of the community who care about the public education. And in background discussions, both of their names came up as 2 outstanding academics and folks who also understand what's going on in the communities that they have researched and reviewed. And I thought that a brief presentation by both of them, and I provided the commission with some of their writings, which I think were very insightful, that it would give us some ideas how to think outside the box in preparing what is a constitutional document. And so one of the things I've mentioned to them when we're putting a charter together is we're not going to solve public policy issues with a charter revision, but are there things that we can put in? Are there provisions that we should be thinking about that would show a seriousness of thought on the part of the city of Hartford and its Board of Education to address issues of public engagement in the process, from the election process to the formulation of policy and the execution of policy in our classrooms throughout the city of Hartford. And so I think we have 2 very gifted professors who I think we'll hear from tonight, but we're going to hear from many, many years in the future, because I think they'll be very influential in the world of public policy and the world of education. So that's by way of background, what I'd like to express.
Thank you very much, Steve. And all right, we will kick it first to Dr. Nuama and then to Dr. Collins, and then we'll hold questions till after Dr. Collins is wrapped up, and then we'll hear from the commissioners. So Dr. Nuama, you have the floor. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's awesome for us academics to have an opportunity to talk to people who are doing work on the ground and to see how that translates. So thanks, Steve, for inviting us and for you all for listening. We're keeping our presentations at about 10 minutes, and I'm going to speak a little bit more in a broader way. And I think it's wonderful that Jonathan's able to join because he has experiments where he's tried things and can give you guys some more specifics. And I just want to start by saying that all of my work is really interested in thinking about how citizens can get all of what democracy promises, and thinks that, education, because most Americans have experiences with education, is really the primary mechanism for allowing that to happen. So the spirit of my comments, I think, will be made through that lens. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and I, don't want to undermine you all's ability or experience, but I'm going to start by just talking at the basic level about why public participation is important, just so we're all on the same page. And then I'll talk specifically about some ideas that I've seen through my work as to how we can improve it. So first, let's just talk about why this is generally important. Why is this something that we care about doing, even when we have trained experts who probably can be great representatives, why working directly with the public is important. And so first, it's important to just not take for granted the fact that, it really emphasizes local grassroots ways of participating as opposed to just central forms. It allows local communities to be engaged in the formulation of solutions to their particular needs and preferences, right? It localizes those solutions. It allows residents the opportunity to imagine and implement innovations that depart from what we might read in textbooks, right? And, residents and officials may have local knowledge that can be useful in informing strategies in ways that central organizations may not have thought of, right? So this is basically saying that there's something probably the community knows about their own experiences that are valuable for people in central organizations, professional organizations to keep in mind. And that's why we encourage public participation on matters that affect their lives. But I want to make sure that we don't leave this with you all thinking that as academics, we don't understand on the ground why engaging in the public is important. So I just want to run really quickly through some of the limits that we recognize so that we could talk about how to move through those limits. So first, the problem of scale, right? So when you're trying to engage the public and take that information, how much input is enough? How are you systematic about gathering input? How do you translate that input, right? Complexity, right? So once you actually gauge input, how can you incorporate it into the actual decision-making process? The division of labor of government. So you all know your role as commission. What is the role of the public and how do they work with you all to make decisions? Like what actually is that process? Special interest, which is the thing that I always hear school boards mention. How do we make sure that we have a diverse representation of people who are participating when we do solicit the public? We know that school board elections can get expensive. Jonathan can talk about LA, it was in the news that the last election, the turnout was like 11%, right? And so even when we do engage in the public and we give the power to the people, we may not actually see the participation levels to the point which we would expect. And then who do we actually hold accountable? I'm from Chicago. It's really easy to, blame Rahm Emanuel or Lori Lightfoot. It's very different when you have a 21-person school board, right? Who do you blame? How do you direct that? And then just lack of time and professional expertise. Many people, I suspect, who are on the commission have experiences with education that are valuable, and people on the ground have personal experiences but may not be trained in decision making. And so when we think about how to overcome these barriers in the literature, historically in political science, we've talked about taking an empowered participation approach, where we talk about, how can these public agencies, including police departments and school systems, figure out how to create responsive, fair, and innovative ways of engaging the public. I'm going to speak specifically about participation and not as much as deliberation, because that's actually Jonathan's specialty. And I'm going to actually, in the next few slides, talk through some specific ways that I've seen in my research that we can actually make participation actually empowering for the public in the sort of truest sense of that. And so first, opportunities to participate must be democratic. And so you might say, of course, but I mean something very specific by that. I mean, it's important to make sure that if people come to participate, decision makers are in the room, not just their representatives. So for example, when schools were being closed in Chicago, the people who attended were a lot of the staff. They actually weren't the people who were making decisions about whether to close schools or not. People recognize that they're not speaking to the decision makers, and that obviously makes a difference. This is something that you hear community members mention all the time. I actually looked you all, where you guys hold meetings before, the pandemic, and I'm not sure, but a lot of times in Chicago and Philly and other places I've studied, these meetings are held downtown as opposed to in the community. This may seem minor, but it makes a huge difference in terms of accessibility and being able to attend. From what I could gather, it looked like that might be similar for you all. And the thing that I think is taken for granted especially is that it's important to be transparent about how the information that you get from the public is actually going to be used. So when I ask people, okay, you guys are going through a revision process and you want public input. When you get that input, how exactly are you going to use it? That's actually really hard for commissioners to respond. Is there a rubric? Does that data go into a portal that's then calculated? What actually happens? And so, for example, Philadelphia opened up their first board meeting after the pandemic recently, and they had it such where you could provide written feedback, but you couldn't actually participate publicly with the commissioners during the meeting. People notice that their participation then isn't clearly going to translate if they're not actually given opportunities to have a dialogue. And so one thing that is extremely important that we know even in our individual lives are that resources matter. So the public must be provided with resources to participate in a very clear and discrete way. So that means that transportation to get to meetings, language translation services, especially in communities that have people who come from Hispanic populations or other places, childcare so they can attend those meetings, even if they're virtual. That this is essential for encouraging participation. And it may even make citizens who were discouraged from participating actually give the government a second chance. So again, in the case of Chicago, for example, we recently published a paper where we show that communities that lived near schools that were closed went from participating in community meetings at the lowest levels in Chicago to participating at the highest levels after Chicago Public Schools give them resources for buses, transportation, held community meetings in their community, and created offices of community engagement. And so we can see people go from the lowest participation to the highest just by providing resources. That's the same things that we need every day, right? And I like to emphasize that these resources have to be distributed in a door-to-door fashion. I like to think about the census. Well, we want everyone to count. We literally knock on doors for the census. A similar thing has to happen when you want people to come out who don't normally come out. It has to be aggressive in terms of the way that you actually go about recruiting people to participate. There should be a clear timeline associated with participation. So this line is directly connected to the previous one. People have limited resources. And so if you drag out a process to participate over 2 years, you're not going to get high engagement over 2 years. If you tell people there's a direct and discrete amount of time for which they can participate, then people can gather the limited resources they have and expend them during that short period of time, as opposed to over the long period of time. This also allows community organizations that are typically a part of getting local people to participate a deliberate amount of time in which they can expend their resources to help on a particular issue area, because those community groups also don't have resources for which they can expend over a 2-year period of time. So as you're thinking about this revision period, I think that's important to keep in mind as well. You want to give communities time to participate, but you also want to make sure that they're clear on the start and end. And then finally, but obviously not least, of the particular things we would want to keep in mind is their participation must be tied to a specific outcome. So what do I mean by that? I think that people want to, school districts want to be perceived as collecting community input, but it's not extremely clear how that's actually shaping any material outcome for that community in a direct way. And communities notice that. They don't want to participate just for participation's sake, just to say that they were a part of it. I was there. They actually want an outcome that's material. They want to know how their feedback led to a specific policy initiative. So basically what I'm saying is that democratic participation must result in a democratic response from government. Otherwise, you risk low participation and mistrust. And so people keep talking about how participation has been low and they know that communities have mistrust. But when you get people to participate and it's like a spectacle of participation, it's symbolic. It's not actually clear how that participation led to a different policy outcome. You can't expect people to continue to participate. I think Jonathan or others will probably reference this throughout the time, but one way that communities tend to do this is through participatory budgeting, for example, where they'll give a certain allocation of their budget to the community, say 5% or 10%, and then have them decide where that money goes. And that's a clear material way, right, that people can then see themselves engaged in a specific outcome. And so that's something to consider about in terms of consider as you think about your provisions going forward. How are you going to show the community you're directly responsible, they're responsible for a particular outcome? And so as I'm thinking about, how this applies to the circumstances that you all find yourselves in, I saw that part of the revision process is engaging in public hearings. And how you go about doing that is going to be extremely important. And so when I emphasize democratic dialogue and exchange, specifying whether it's through a rubric or some algorithm, but being very clear how that public input is going to be used to determine your final provisions are extremely important. And being transparent about that is going to be essential if you want to encourage participation. Really ensuring that you have a pocket of resources that you're using to reduce the cost of participation is also going to be important. So what time are these meetings held? Where are they held? What resources are you allocating to make sure that this happens is going to be critical. Because as I said before, we saw that actually got people who participated at very low levels to participate at the highest levels. It was probably the most effective thing to getting people out. Finally, you need to actually respond. So I am kind of being a little shady here when I talk about this because I saw that, in 2013, you guys had a revision process and the community said what they wanted, but the assembly never moved on it. And if you do that, you can't expect people to keep participating. And so it needs to be linked to a material outcome that needs to happen. I saw that, there may be an interesting opportunity to revisit the school board, right? And the fact that it had been partially appointed and partially elected. And in terms of getting people to participate, it's important to really consider the fact that people are discouraged from participation when they don't clearly have the power to change anything. And when you have a school board that's mostly appointed, then people get the message that they may not have the power because ultimately the power resides in the district. So that's important to keep in mind, especially when 90% of the nation's school boards are actually elected. Related to that, this is really, kind of basic that, these school board elections typically are have better turnout when they were held during general elections. That's just across the board. So mayoral elections tend to have about a 50% turnout compared to 5% turnout for school board elections when they're not during the same cycle. So the discrepancy can be really, really wide. And so that's also a really small micro fix that can make a difference for increasing participation at the electoral level. And so hopefully those things provided some specifics. I'm going to stop here. I'm really looking forward to Q&A, and I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nuama. Dr. Collins, you have the floor.
Hey, let's see. It's always a treat when I get to share space with my great friend, Dr. Nuama. We started the journey together as graduate students, doing education, politics research, and people looking at us like we had 6 ears and 4 eyeballs. And it's great to be in a position now where we can really put our work forward and put our work forward in front of audiences like this. This is why we talk about, doing the work that we do. We've always had these conversations. So it's surreal to be here. And so what I'll talk about is this idea of can we actually sort of institutionalize democratic innovation? And so I think Sally laid the table very well in offering very specific strategies, broad yet specific strategies of how we can increase participation. And then what I want to hone in on is one specific intervention that I've kind of been going around making a case for. And so the way to think about it is something that I'm sure everyone on this Zoom call understands really well, is that public meetings are these ubiquitous things. They're happening everywhere all the time. Yet they're not necessarily being maximized. And so, in the political science literature, there's been this discussion of school boards actually as illusions of democracy. And yeah, you have these meetings every month. Yeah, you have these elections, but the voter turnout rate is so low, right? The special interests are taking over and determining the election outcomes and the agendas that these boards are taking up. There are these large donors who are controlling the elections. And then there's more valid critique coming from Professor Norma about how these boards often silence the most vulnerable groups. But then on the other hand, there's also a little bit of a speck of optimism that maybe school boards can still be these sites for democracy. And so there's evidence that school boards provide a mechanism for holding schools accountable. There is still evidence that you can find electoral accountability happening at the school board level, especially in urban districts. These are sites for political empowerment. So minority representation is something that happens in school boards more often relative to a lot of other institutions. And then, just kind of from a utility standpoint, really keying in on what Professor Norma was just talking about, which is this direct access. The fact that, there are barriers, but there is this ability to get in the car, head down to a district office, and actually attend a meeting versus, I've never been to a congressional meeting. It looks kind of cool, I guess, on a C-SPAN, but the accessibility issue is there in a way at the federal level that you don't actually have at the local level. So it creates these opportunities for direct participation. And I want to key in on that. And so, how can local institutions actually increase participation? So there's this access. You can get in your car, you can drive downtown to the district office for a meeting, but a lot of people don't. So this is self-reported data from the ANES. This is the American National Election Study. It's a survey that political scientists get together and field every 4 years. And one of the questions that has been consistently on the survey for the last 20 years has been this question about, have you attended a meeting over the past year? And it's not a perfect measure, but it's some sort of measure to give us an indication of how much people actually attend these school board and city council meetings. And consistently over time, we find only about 30% of Americans even attend one meeting in a given year. If this was what when this is what turnout looks like, we could say democracy is in a complete crisis. But this has been happening when it comes to public meetings for quite some time now, but it hasn't gotten the same attention. And so what I want to make a case for is this idea of embedding direct response to public comment into the meeting structure, which is something that could actually sort of improve participation. And so the more theoretical idea here, as Professor Norma was suggesting, is that, there's this idea of citizen deliberation. And when you get people together, they can have conversation, and they have conversation around specific policy issues. They can have this sort of back and forth, and they can engage in reasoned argumentation around policy issues. This is supposed to lead to a specific set of good outcomes. They're supposed to learn more about policy through the discourse. Their trust in the institution and the process itself should increase. And then they become more likely to participate in the future. And something that's really sort of critical, I think what we're seeing now is it's supposed to help us find more policy agreement and sort of decrease polarization. And so embedding response to public comment doesn't get us all the way to this idea of deliberation, but it creates this element of back and forth of dialogue that kind of becomes, I think, an important step towards getting us to public deliberation in these environments. And so I wanted to kind of study this idea of like what would happen if a school board actually embedded direct response to public comment into their public meeting structure. And so I built the survey experiment around it. And this was I took video clips from a school board meeting. I found a school board in Southern California, Burbank Unified School District, And they got this wonky idea and decided, you know what, we're going to have public comment. And then right after public comment, we're going to embed direct response. So the school board, no matter what the public commenter say, the school board has to provide some sort of response to the comment. They have to either justify the decision that the commenters are raising an issue about. They have to express agreement, disagreement. There has to be some sort of like response legally. And so I thought it was cool that they did this. And so again, I built this experiment around it. And I wanted to know how people are impacted just by being exposed to this kind of environment. Because for me, just seeing it was different, and it was kind of empowering. But I was wondering if it would have the same kind of effect on just kind of your lay person, and especially the typical person who's probably like me before I started doing this research, which is a person who really hated meetings. And so this is just to visualize sort of what the different participants are seeing. So you're randomly assigned one of the groups. You either got the first treatment, which is a neighboring district that they didn't embed public response to public comment. So this is your typical school board meeting. No one comes, there's no attendance. They read the agenda items, and then they move on to the next one. Here, treatment 2 is another meeting where there is a similar agenda item. The agenda item is teacher pay, the idea of teacher pay negotiations for teacher salaries. This time, some teachers and members of the public show up, and then they give public comment to the school board. The school board does what the typical school board does in that situation, which is they don't respond at all. And then they move on to the next agenda item. And then the last treatment is this Burbank Unified School District, where it's the same thing happening. It's the same agenda item, but this time the school board, you can see in the last couple of frames, they actually have to give a response to why they're not going to pay teachers more. And I thought it was going to be rough. That's a tough one to explain. But what I saw is just post-treatment that people who got the participation treatment and the deliberation treatment were a little bit more likely to express trust, but not necessarily specific differences pre-treatment, but compared to the people who saw the standard meeting. So essentially what is happening at the aggregate level, exposure to the standard meeting where people just read the agenda item and move on to the next item, that actually decreased trust, whereas the participation and deliberation treatments were allowed us to sort of maintain trust levels. But when you look deeper into the data and look at specifically people who had low levels of trust pre-treatment, this is where you really start to see the differences emerge. The folks who had low levels of trust in government pre-treatment, they were much more responsive to the deliberation treatment and more responsive to the participation treatment than the standard meeting. Similar thing is happening with the notion of being willing to attend a meeting in the future. Just, hey, would you like to attend? Would you be willing to attend a meeting in the future after having sort of seen this school board meeting that you just witnessed? And you see again a stronger preference for attending a meeting when you receive the deliberation treatment, and it's a little bit higher for people who had no prior meeting attendance, but it's actually at its best for people who've also had a little bit of meeting experience exposure. And then when I look at it by race, and people of color are really responsive to the deliberation treatment, especially Asian Americans were probably the most responsive. But then also you see about a 12-point difference amongst Latinx Americans in terms of their when they were exposed to the deliberation or the participation treatment. African Americans were the lone group that were more skeptical of the deliberation treatment than the participation treatment. But you can see across groups, there's more preference for the democratic innovation techniques. And so in conclusion, institutionalizing direct response to public comment can generate increased trust in local institutions, and then increases future meeting attendance. And then this strategy can be particularly impactful for people of color and those with low trust in government. And so the last thing I want to add is just that, this suggests that there are these ways to increase participation even further. And so again, going back to what's happening theoretically here, structured deliberation is really the goal. And so if you can have a meeting structured where people come, you can break them into small groups, you can give them information to read beforehand, and then allow them to deliberate during the meeting over the information that you've given them sort of prior to the meeting. This kind of structured deliberation, this is where you see the major increases in policy knowledge, policy agreement, institutional trust, and future participation. The issue here is that formal deliberations often struggle to handle mass stakeholder participation. So it's fine when you only have, 50, 100, 150 people, but let's say you want to have a mass public deliberation with, thousands of people, the entire sort of constituency. Managing these kinds of situations get extremely difficult. This is why at least taking the step to institutionalize response to public comment is something that sort of gets us halfway. But I think if we really want to see the substantive gains, things like participatory budgeting that center around this kind of like structured deliberation, this is the thing that will really increase participation for the long run. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So we will now open it up to commissioner questions. And as usual, if you'd like to ask a question of either one of our panelists, you can raise your hand or use the raise hand function. And I see Commissioner Gallon-Clark has a question, so we will call on her first. And after Commissioner Gallon-Clark, we will go to Commissioner Rubenstein. Commissioner Gallon-Clark, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair Wolf. Professor Naima, am I pronouncing it right? I am sitting here trying to really just compose myself. I'm so excited about meeting you, talking to you. The article that you wrote on the cost of participating while poor and Black toward a theory of collective participatory debt. I sent that to my organizing department today. I said, this is a must read. I mean, it was so on point. My question to you has nothing to do, well, maybe it does, about the article. If you can just respond to what you believe are the differences between community engagement versus community partnership. Do you see a difference? It was a big conversation that we had this week.
First, thank you for such kind words.
It's really deserved.
I really appreciate that. So my first thought is absolutely. I think that which is actually also why I'm excited by Professor Collins' direct test, I think, of some of these interventions, because engagement really can be just a spectacle. It really can be a parading of public input. And I talked to enough school district leaders in Chicago and Philadelphia, at least, to know that sometimes people really do want to be perceived as collecting input. And then it's like, you have to be like an investigative journalist to determine what is happening with that input, if anything. And I think the biggest difference between engagement and partnership is the lack of transparency around how to take that input and actually translate it to a decision in a way that is logical. I like partnership, though, as a term, because I think it takes it even a step above, honestly, some of what we're describing, because it actually requires treating the community as equals. And that requires a lot of deliberate intention because the power dynamic isn't there. And so you have to really go out of your way to understand what it means for a community that has less money and less power to be able to actually be positioned as a partner. And I actually think that the participatory budgeting piece, that's part of why it's something that has been proposed, because when you're entrusting the community with the purse, the public purse, you're saying that you can be a partner and making decisions that affect you, as opposed to just saying we're going to hear what you say and then say nothing back, which is, I think, more along the lines of engagement. So thank you for that question. I absolutely think that they're different. And I think that partnership provides a message to the community that you treat them as equals, and is what we should be leaning toward.
Okay, I have another question for you. I could actually talk to you the whole time, but I will, again, I'm just going to restrain myself. So you're right about, if you looked at Hartford, we definitely have, as a city, have gone through this motion of saying, oh, your input is important, and then do nothing with it. I talked to a lot of residents, and they are just tired of hearing, oh, we want your input. They do not trust the system, and they don't even show up. They don't even turn out. So how can we as a commission be even more intentional that not only do we want to hear their input, but we show them that we're going to do something with their input? What can we do to be really intentional?
Yeah, this sounds basic, but I really, really do think resources matter. So I think if there were some resources allocated to, I don't necessarily mean paying a particular person to participate. I just mean distributing resources maybe to those partner organizations to facilitate the coming out of people who would ordinarily not participate. I think that could be helpful. As I mentioned before, I don't know where you guys are holding meetings or what resources are provided to enable people to be able to engage. But if they're in person, I know you guys mentioned earlier the hybrid, then they need to, where they happen really does matter. Like I said, the availability of childcare really does matter. The clear rubric for how that participation is going to be used really does matter. The timeline for when you will show people how that participation was used to create a particular outcome does matter. And right now, most places don't do that. Most places you talk, they say, we hear you. And then a couple weeks later, a report comes out and no one knows how it came about. So sometimes I feel like we can't even get to the real innovation because we're just trying to get translators in Spanish communities. And so if those are all things that you all are doing and you're still not getting people out, then I'd be happy to talk more about what we can do. But if those basic things aren't happening, then I think that's a place to start.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gallen-Clark. Commissioner Rubenstein.
Thank you, Commissioner. I enjoyed both presentations immensely today. But my question is for Professor Collins. Professor, we are a city of approximately 120,000, 80%, 85% is minority of color. We're a poor city, probably in the top 20 cities in the country, with a horrendous, what I'll call horrendous, and others have called a horrendous voting percentage for boards of education. I know of some years it was 9 or 12%. Do you think in order to get the public more engaged, it would be important, the heretofore Board of Ed has had their meetings in the Board of Ed office, to mandate that maybe a third of their meetings has to be in the different sections of the city? Maybe that would increase some public engagement in the city more than we've had, number one. And number two, our city has a charter which was put together 20 years ago, a generation ago, in which the mayor picks or selects 5 of the 9 members. Before 2001, the 9 members of the Board of Education were elected. And we're the capital city, but in other large cities in Connecticut, like Bridgeport, Waterbury, Norwalk, and I can name others that are similar in size to Hartford, they elect all their members to the Board of Education. Do you think that, and I'm sorry the question's so long, do you think that by having appointments as opposed to elections, that is dampening the energy of folks that should be engaged civilly?
Well, Bruce, thank you for those are great questions. I mean, I'm admittedly agnostic to representation structure. I feel like we've seen poor representation from both formats, appointed and elected. but here are essentially there are a couple of trade-offs. So the argument for the appointment style is that yes, we have the school board elections that have such low turnout. And so if we gave authority to the mayor and then the mayor had this appointment power, then education is being decided at an election that's generating more turnout. So it's on the ballot with more salience. More people are going to vote for mayor, and therefore if they're voting for the mayor because of their education plan, then you're going to get a more you're going to get greater accountability through this pathway. The argument against that is that education isn't the only issue on the table when a mayor runs. So some people may be electing a mayor because they're concerned with who this person would appoint to be on the school board. But then there are other people that care about zoning ordinances and land use policies. There are people who care about environmental sustainability. There are people who just care about parking. And so all of this is getting lumped into the ability to determine what the structure of the education policy decision-making engine really looks like. And that could be, not ideal. Even within the representative structure, you have at large versus your sub-district structure. And the at large district structure has been great for kind of divorcing geography from representation. But then at the same time, when you do that, because of segregation, because of neighborhood segregation, you drastically hurt the representation for people of color on boards. And so how do you kind of find a happy middle ground? San Diego is doing something really interesting where they do, I think it's at-large nominations and then sub-district elections. And so you have to kind of be nominated across the city, but then like people in your community ultimately select. And I think that's something that sort of walks the middle ground that I think has been pretty useful. I just kind of looked to San Diego as a place that seems to be doing some relatively good things with their representation and their governance structure. I mean, their last superintendent is now the deputy secretary of education. So, they're doing some things right over there. To the first question, the first question was about participate. Could you remind me the first question? I don't know, was it?
Yes,
related?
the first question had to do with meetings. Heretofore, all the meetings have been at the Board of Ed office and not out in the community. And I was wondering that if the Charter Revision Commission mandated a certain percentage of the meetings that to be held out in the community in the different sections of the city, that might gin up some community engagement.
I think it can. Professor Norma talked about this, and I think she's right. And I think it can, but then on the front end, there has to be, the school boards, the boards themselves, they have to embrace it. So there has to be, for lack of a less technical term, some sort of electoral incentive. There has to be kind of like public preference and clear public demand for it, versus it being instituted and then people just kind of find it happening. But I think once the clear expectation is created for this to be the case, then it can be extremely effective. For my dissertation work, I was studying the school districts in LA County, and I noticed the districts that seemed to get the most engagement, they did these kinds of creative sort of wonky things. They would relocate their meetings to different parts of the district. They would turn some meetings into workshops. And so there was no board sitting behind the table. It was, here are specific issues within the district that we're going to just kind of workshop through. We're going to have information sessions, a participatory budgeting initiative that I was evaluating over the summer in this city right outside of Providence called Central Falls, mostly Latinx community. And we had translators at every meeting. We had food. We provided childcare. And then we also let kids participate. And so one of the things that I like about your charter too is the fact that you are allowing students to participate. And I think even kind of expanding that to create kind of like little kind of subcommittees that'll get even more students involved. Because from some of this other project I was working on too, one of the things I noticed is that when kids are in the room with adults, they never want to say anything. But then when you get the kids to themselves, oh man, they got all kind of stuff to say. So creating like independent commissions where students can be on boards, advisory boards, and actually make recommendations to the board, I think would be really a really cool way to get more participation too. Might be something that also helps parents participate if they see their kids doing it, because it's like if you see your kid doing it, you don't want to not be doing it yourself too. So yeah, I think with the meeting structure stuff, I think is really important.
Thank you, Professor. It's very illuminating.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubenstein. Commissioner Rivera.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So for me, I just, as a resident, I would like if you guys could share a little bit about the importance of advocating for residents, right? For some of us that are sitting at these tables and engaging in different meetings and being at different tables where important decisions are being made, how can we continue to stay focused on bringing some of the residents' voice to these tables, right? Because I would say for me, it's sometimes intimidating to be in different settings. So I could just imagine how residents feel, right? To just show up at a meeting and just raise their hand to ask a question. So for some of us on the ground, can you just share a little bit about the importance of continuing these conversations in our communities and how we could work with residents to be able to bring some of those voices to settings like we are on today?
Yeah, I think the work you're doing is super important and is the work, honestly. And I think it also speaks to why resident representation is important, because it actually does help to enable that comfortability that's necessary to get participation. In the absence of a lot of representation by residents, I think, all we can do is to try to get people to participate in the forums that are available. This kind of goes back to the community piece, right? That I think Bruce was referencing, where, part of why the idea of doing these meetings in community became important was so that people could feel like, oh, I go to church here, right? Or my son goes to school here, so I'm comfortable being able to participate in this context because it's one in which, I'm empowered in this space, as opposed to going to a district meeting in a more formal setting. But like I said before, I think that sort of finding different ways to engage as well. When I talk about like door knocking, what we do with the census, like some of my other work that's outside of education is working with people who were recently released from prison. And the census, as well as the poll watching, always recruits them to participate. And they participate and they engage and they help their communities participate. And part of how they get them to engage is by asking that, like literally knocking on doors and literally, getting them to work with one another. And once you get a lot of different residents involved and they have a larger representation of those who attend these meetings, then they'll feel comfortable. I think the biggest thing is just it being an individual person or being one person who has to be the representative. I think that's a lot of pressure. So I think the more that we can actually get representation on the board of residents, but also more people who attend these places to be residents, and then for it to happen at places that people are comfortable with, then that voice hopefully can come out more naturally. But I think that boards often underappreciate how aggressive one has to be. That's why I keep using like door knocking, like how aggressive you have to be to make people feel like you actually want them to participate. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner? Okay, I guess not. we will go to Commissioner Medina.
I think Commissioner Clark had her hand raised.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, sorry.
But because I asked the question, I can wait until Commissioner Medina, because I just have a question for.
No,
Professor
please do.
Collins.
Please do. I can wait until after.
Okay,
Commissioner Dallin Clark.
thank you so much. Professor Collins, I saw you smiling while I was describing the condition that we've experienced here. I have a question for you. It seems like there would have been more of an increase in the deliberative process that you mentioned, because it seems like that's, instead of just sitting there and looking at the person while they're giving their comments, there's a give and take in communication. Why do you believe, or why do you think that African Americans were less responsive to that type of give and take? I have my own ideas. Why do you think?
I think it's exactly what Professor Noema is finding in her paper, in that there is just this skepticism as to how genuine the process is. And so I do, after I show them the school board meeting, I have them I just asked them kind of an open-ended response question. I was just like, hey, tell me what you thought about that. And the Black respondents were intrigued, but there was just this kind of skepticism as to whether or not it was going to result into like real policy change. And when you've been overlooked and neglected for so long, even a process that is not only participatory but has this element of real like physical engagement, then there's still this like this distrust as to whether or not it would turn into something. And so that's why a repeated game is important. It goes back to I'll go back to talking about the project that I've been doing in Central Falls, and so two of the most interesting things that we find, I think, is that one, we have with participatory budgeting, it has a delegate model. So with participatory budgeting, you want at first engage in idea collection. So you send out a survey to everybody in the community trying to get their preferences for the kinds of things that they want to see money used for. And then you have a delegate group that is responsible for turning those idea preferences into separate proposals that the community ultimately votes on. And so they work in small groups developing their proposals. And this is where we really saw the impact, like the ability to workshop through specific ideas that they wanted to see utilized with the public funds. And the biggest change that we see amongst the participants really is their social bonds strengthened. It was the relationships that they built with one another, with other community members, and this kind of collective empowerment that they felt. And I think unless you have a process like that, where government is empowering you to, one, have preferences, express those preferences, and turn that into policy, this like belief that, we believe that you're more than capable and that you have the best interest in the community as a whole at heart is there. And then we are going to empower you to work with other community members who you don't even know. But the fact that you share this space, there's going to be this opportunity for bonding and bridging. And so the funny thing about it is satisfaction with the school board actually goes down after, but satisfaction with the process goes up, and the strength of the bonds go up. And then their ideas of how powerful community groups are, like that goes up exponentially. And so I think, why was there this skepticism? Because there wasn't this opportunity for real empowerment. But I think, I'm finding in some of the more localized work that I'm doing that when that's on the table, you see some of that skepticism go away.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Medina, followed by Commissioner Smith.
Thank you to both professors. Both the materials that were sent in advance and your presentations have been illuminating and really fantastic. And in my own process of trying to figure out participation within the city of Hartford and what that means, first I have I guess one question related to specific participation given the context of the community that we live in. and whether or not you've seen this in similar in other cities, and if there are any solutions responding to what are fundamental like needs within the community. And obviously, like issues of income and poverty are certainly one. Childcare is another one. Volunteering is not cheap; it's expensive, and we often just assume that it's free, and it's not. And people are, you know, especially in the city of Hartford, where folks have, by and large, hourly employment. Like it's a lot. But the other challenge that we have in Hartford is, I think in 2019, the data shows that for people in Hartford ages 25 and above, the highest level of educational attainment being either high school or less than high school, it's almost 60% of the city. And wondered, how do we, one, when we're thinking not just about the Board of Education and Board of Education meetings and how parents interact with that system, but just the city as a whole, if you have any recommendations, guidelines, or if you've thought about the role in the context of the community you're playing in, where educational attainment is different than another municipality where, you know, maybe it's different. You have more people that have a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree or something like that. So that's my first question. Then I have another question for that.
I can jump in really quickly on that. And I'll say that on one end, this is why opportunities for just like, you know, policy education are really important. And honestly, there's a thing that I forgot to mention too, leveraging civic groups, kind of going back to Commissioner Jeter's comment, which was leverage the civic groups and show that as a commission, you're willing to have very generative and inclusive dialogues with groups, because they're going to be so much better at mobilizing than you all are. And when you, from watching way too many board meeting videos, I can tell you that when you do see the participation at strong levels, it's usually tied to some sort of civic group that's mobilized people. They, you know, because they'll do policy education. They'll you know, provide the structure. They'll drum up the political interest that's necessary, and they'll emphasize the importance of the accountability. And so I think, but if the relationship with the board and the civic groups is contentious, you know, there will be participation. You might not have a fun 4 hours, but there will be participation. But trying to establish more cooperative and generative relationships with civic groups, I think, is important.
I would say the same thing. The only thing I would add is that we actually see that education doesn't correlate with direct participation in the ways that you would expect. And I think part of that is because people, if, you know, school boards hopefully can embrace this, but people really do know a lot about their lives and their experiences. And so the community groups can help translate those things and through teach-ins. And when school boards provide resources to those community groups, they actually do help them translate those personal experiences into participation. But if we embrace the fact that, you know, those groups have participated across the country and have used their personal experiences to participate, if we start from that starting point, it's just how can we get them to actually, you know, come out? Like, we go back to the same story of how we can get them to come out. So I just wanted to clarify that, although I totally recognize the importance of recognizing education levels as well.
No, that's super helpful and great clarity. So thank you. My last question is, it's about actually what you were mentioning about the power of the census and door knocking. And part of the challenge that it seems like we have in Hartford is, as others have mentioned, people don't believe in the political process. A lot of that is as a result of the political structure that exists, not just in this city, but in a lot of localities in Connecticut, where it's a specific game of a few privileged people who control votes. And it's reflective in our turnout that we don't have significant turnout in any election cycle. Well, except like the national elections and stuff like that and statewide elections. But so I was trying to figure out if there's something outside of the electoral process that can be mandated in a city charter, something like a census of the city, either on an annual basis or biannual basis, that forces the city to have to door knock and have to provide the funding to have to actually engage with the residents of Connecticut, because it's a mandate that where we're collecting information. That said, I take everything that you've said about like collecting information is not in and of itself the goal, and often can be a deterrence if people don't feel like it's meaningful. But wanted to get your sense of if something like that, a mandated need for a census of the city, may be an additive component to the electoral process, given that not many people believe in it, or it would seem that at least the ingredients that we have currently does not encourage participation in the electoral process.
That's a tough one. I'd be curious what Jonathan thinks, because it's tough, because I don't know about the situation in Harvard, but I know that in some of the cases that I studied, even the process of having a charter revision process came through community people saying we need a process. So we wouldn't even have opportunities for public input in many cities if it weren't for communities demanding that. And then they get turned into these formulaic things that don't actually tie to a material outcome that's like mandated. So that's why you keep hearing me reference these like material outcomes, because the processes that are in place are because of the public. And we can do that again in a different way. But I hope that as you guys consider, your own processes, that you think about how to also think about the outcomes that those processes are connected to. So I feel like I'm going back to the same thing, but
No, it makes sense. It makes sense. But I appreciate that. It provided me clarity on the same thing you had said before. So thank you.
Just a quick two finger though. The only thing about mandating that kind of outreach is that it could be dangerous in the wrong hands. So the whole progressive reform era was about getting rid of patronage politics, where people were kind of doing this thing, but like in a very quid pro quo way. So I show up at your door, I give you a turkey, you vote for me, I'm the captain now, kind of thing. And so like we moved away from that, sort of. Like there's a new breed of local leader who is committed to a high level of integrity when it comes to this kind of thing. But like you just have to have some sort of mechanism in place to make sure that you maintain that from a legal standpoint, so that you don't have people exploiting this as an opportunity to harbor political power and create kind of a corrupt system. It could lead to some corruption if it's in the wrong hands.
Those are my questions. Thank you so much. That was super helpful.
Thank you, Commissioner Medina. Commissioner Smith.
Yes, very quickly and briefly. Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank both of our guests for their presentation tonight. But Dr. Nwamwa, did I pronounce that right? I probably butchered it. I wanted to thank you. You don't know my 5-month-old daughter, but she will have your book by her bedside. I thank you for advocating for women. Now that I'm a father of a young girl, I really appreciate your work even more. So I thank you so much, and I definitely will be doing a lot of reading and watching of your films. That's it.
I should come around here more. You guys. Thanks so much.
All right. Any other questions for Commissioner Gale?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both. I have a question for each of you, if I may. First, for Professor Collins, you talked about institutionalizing a response to public participation, and I'm not sure I quite caught the gist of it, but it sounded like you were suggesting that when you have a period of public comment before a meeting, that there be some mechanism for the board at which people are commenting to then respond to the comments. And we have that. Our Board of Education has public comment before, I think it has it before every one of its meetings. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think they do. We certainly have on the City Council at Hartford. We certainly have public comment at City Council as well. But I'm interested to hear what mechanism you may have seen other communities use for responding to public comment. You know, public comment in my experience is wide ranging, not often directed to the agenda that's before the board that night. It may, you know, sometimes it just comes out of left field, if you will. And then you're dealing with a group of elected board members or appointed board members, whatever, in our case, 9 members, you know, who's deciding who's responding to what. Clearly, these are not unified responses. Anyway, I'm just kind of interested if you've seen a mechanism. I'd love to understand how somebody else has tried it. I mean, I'm certainly willing to consider anything. It sounds like it might be an interesting, but it also sounds like it could devolve into chaos. But anyway, go for it.
Well, so I'll clarify what this school district did. So in their meeting agenda, they literally institutionalized response to public comment. So on every agenda, there is public comment, and then immediately following it, it's board response. So the school board president and the superintendent usually say something in response to the public comment that's made. And I'll give you a light example, and it's where I thought it was really useful. And so the district had implemented this dress code, and this is Southern California. And so the dress code was, it prevented students from wearing tank tops, which, you know, if you know anything about Southern California weather, that's a pretty big, you know, policy shift there, right? And so, but it was something that really, really was targeted towards girls. It had this huge sexist dimension because girls wear tank tops more than the guys. And so the students actually showed up to the school board meeting to, you know, contest the dress code. And the beauty of it was they highlighted the sexist dimension of it. And so, you know, after some female students spoke, even some male students came up and spoke on behalf of their female colleagues. And then after that, the board had to respond. And so then one of the board members actually starts agreeing with the students and starts talking about how when he was in high school, he used to wear like heavy metal t-shirts or something. And so it became this moment where they were able to get some sort of response and see that there was, that they were being heard, listened to, and valued in a particular way. And they actually went back and changed the dress code policy. Now, I mean, every story isn't going to be that neat and clean, but just having this moment where you have to actually respond to public comment, I think it could be useful. But Commissioner Gale, to your point, it could also be chaotic because there are some people that are going to show up to a school board meeting to talk about access to the tennis court at a middle school. And not for kids either, just like for an adult who wants to go play tennis on the weekend, right? And so like you have to give a response to that. I mean, if you institutionalize it, yes. And, you know, that could be, you know, counterproductive. And so, but I think you take the good with the bad. And then if you do it, let me know so I can study it.
I will let you know when it's 11 p.m. and we're still responding.
You don't have to respond to every comment either. So what they do is they let all the commenters comment and then they respond. They give a brief response to the comments at large.
And that, you know, and certainly, you know, you at these meetings, you do pick up themes and you can take the top 3 themes and respond to them. But let me move on to Professor Nuama, talking about participation in elections. We are less than 3 weeks from a Board of Education election today in Hartford. I think you heard others speak about the low voter turnout. They actually overestimated the turnout. Our last election was less than 5%. It might have been 3.7% turnout. It's abysmal. There was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 voters that turned out in a city of 120,000 for the board election. And here it is, as I said, less than 3 weeks. I doubt any other commissioners can say they've heard a single thing about this election. I haven't received a single thing in the mail. I haven't seen a lawn sign. In fact, but for my going to look for them, I couldn't tell you who the board candidates were. There just really is very little taking place. And some of that is a function of machine politics. We are, this is the land of the party lever. We were one of the last states in the country to get rid of the party lever in Connecticut, and we still have pretty strong party politics. And in a town like Hartford, where I don't know, 85% of our registered voters are Democrats, all the action takes place in the Democratic Party. We have a town committee of 78 people. They choose 3 candidates for Board of Education. 4 candidates get elected. Their 3 candidates get elected every time. There hasn't been a primary in years. And so come November 2nd, I think it is, we've got 4 people we're going to elect. We have 5 people on the ballot. And given the party politics, it's pretty clear that the 3 Dems are going to win, and probably, well, whatever. But all of this brings to my mind, I mean, I'm a party guy. I've been working in the Democratic Party since I could breathe, and working elections, but all of it brings to mind for me the thought that maybe it's time to separate this from party politics and to think about a nonpartisan election, and to see whether in a nonpartisan setting you could potentially get more candidates interested, who then get more of the public interested, right? I mean, as I've mentioned, this campaign process isn't getting anybody interested. And as a guy who's campaigned, I'm an elected official. I mean, I'm out there door knocking all the time. I hear you, and I can tell you I've spent countless hours over countless months over countless years hitting doors on every street in Hartford. And I would love to see board candidates doing that, because it would really touch people. But we don't have that, and I'm here we are with a charter. We have potential to maybe think about something that might change public participation. I'm just wondering what your comments might be about a partisan election versus a nonpartisan election.
I think in the context that you're describing, a nonpartisan election could be valuable. I also think that an elected school board could be valuable in this particular context. I definitely hear Collins describing, I know that you guys have members that are, and those who are appointed, but in thinking about, for example, Chicago, where they're going to have a 21-person board, which could be unwieldy. But one thing that is interesting is that they are doing 10, they're going to divide into into districts, and then have communities represented based on that district. And then people will vote within that district for a person who represents their community, and that person will then be on the board. I imagine that something like that probably will get people who wouldn't ordinarily participate because they can clearly see how they'll be represented on the board in a way that a traditional one-party kind of election wouldn't. And I think that, another way of thinking about that is the nonpartisan thing you're describing. If I think about places like Philadelphia, where that allows opportunities for the working, families party and some of those other kinds of groups to get involved and to be disruptive and to create their own sort of progressive arms outside of the traditional Democratic establishment. I have seen that help and to mobilize people. But I think you have a quintessential. I specialize in disillusionment, and you guys have a quintessential disillusionment problem. And it requires disrupting, and I don't mean tech, we need to disrupt the, I think it just means doing something very different about how you represent people. And, dividing them into representative districts, considering the non-partisan approach as you described, are some potential mechanisms. But I think anything that seems like it would be better if you really care about public participation. And one way of doing that, like I said, is perhaps through electing through, taking your 130,000 people, splitting those districts up, allowing a representative to to be a part of that, and then letting them be on the board, and maybe that could work.
Chair?
Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know how to work the, I'm a little old. Again, in response to John, John, and the commissioner, just to talk to my fellow commissioners and the professors. We've got it. Last time in this process, I was on the other side of the table on council, and we killed it, charter revision in 2010, I believe. We did not support sending all the initiatives to the ballot. So I want to be very practical about what we do. I think John may be correct, but if we go completely nonpartisan elections throughout the board, I'm not sure council will let it go through. And that's a concern. I want to make sure that we do something that can actually get on the ballot and increase participation. Again, I've been for the hybrid models. I wouldn't mind a hybrid model for the Board of Education. We go all elected, but we keep some at large and we go districts on the other. I think that could raise the level of participation. And as I've often advocated, we need to split the electoral process up, have the mayor and the district elections separate, and then have the at-large elections separate from the mayor, and a 2-year process. So we always keep institutional memory, because I think that hurts us when we replace everybody at one time, which we have done a couple times. We lose some of that institutional memory just in terms of how government works. But I'm for nonpartisan elections. I don't think it's a bad idea. I just don't think we could sell it to the entire council. I don't think that. I think we're gonna have trouble getting some of the things we've already changed are going to be recommending. I think those are going to have trouble getting through as it is. Just one man's comments.
Yeah, if I may just respond real quickly, Chair. In the spirit of throwing ideas out there, Commissioner Kennedy, I don't necessarily disagree with you, although some of that might be work that I would have to do with my colleagues to see if I could convince them. But one of the concerns I have about pairing the board election up with the mayoral election, and I thought this through, and I'm,
districts, just not the entire board, just district elections with mayoral elections.
District elections with mayoral elections. Here's my concern that I don't know would be addressed, and that is the Democratic Party nominates a slate. When you go in to vote, there are all the different columns showing mayor, council, board, and on your left it says Democrat. And everybody, as we know, our constituents are going to go right across the board, and it isn't really going to change who gets elected unless there's much more robust primarying going on within the Democratic Party. And so it made me think about the nonpartisan, where now you got a whole separate set of the ballot down below. But this is my argument to make with my colleagues. If this group thought nonpartisan was worth giving it a shot, then it would be part of my job to try to sell it to council.
If I could, John, while we're talking with each other, is I don't disagree with that. As a person who has both been the nominee and the challenger, I don't disagree with that. It is very hard to challenge a party citywide. It's just a lot of territory to take in. However, districts, particularly in the city of Hartford, if you divide it up into 5 or 6 districts, those districts are very small. And the election of the nominee of the party is not guaranteed to win. I've seen that happen many times, where the nominee in state rep races has lost the race to the challenger. And that just sometimes depends on who's the quality of the candidate. And I think if we went district, you could get a much better representation of quality of the candidate versus the party nominee. And the mayor also has a lot of influence on the citywide elections. I mean, people get elected citywide and they feel they owe their election to the mayor. which is why I want to separate the citywide elections from the mayor so that the mayor has less influence on the council and the Board of Ed. But again, we can keep having that discussion. I think, John, we've got the same goal, which is to have a more democracy, big D. And districts, I think, is a way to do that. I just don't know if we could sell total districts across the city in one fell swoop. I think that would be pretty hard to get through council. Just again, some thoughts.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner Kennedy. We'll go to Steve Mennick. I think you have a comment, and then we're going to, after Steve's comment, we're going to stick to questions for our panelists because we are going to have a thorough debate and discussion about all the issues with regards to districts and the composition of the Board of Education and whatnot afterwards, most likely at a separate meeting. But I do want to be cognizant of our panelists' time and also address Steve's comments. So Steve, go ahead. You're on mute, Steve.
I sometimes sound intelligent when I'm on mute, so I usually keep it that way. I was going to say the same thing you were saying, Mr. Chairman, that we're starting to get into debate. The only comment I did want to make was that the issue of nonpartisan elections is something we may have to defer to the General Assembly in the state of Connecticut. So I will look into that if that's something you want me to look into, but that we may not have authority to do nonpartisan elections at this level.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner Rubenstein?
Thank you. My question is to both the professors who did a wonderful job tonight. Our history in Hartford has been one of mostly elections, except for the last 20 years. The elections have been at large, meaning citywide, and the appointments, of course, have been by the mayor only. And the remaining 4 are at large. Sometimes, there's an old adage, sometimes in order to be bold, you have to go off script. And my question to both professors is, do you think that it would be more efficacious to have smaller district elections on the logic that maybe the district residents getting wind of elections in a new way, and in a smaller way where it's more personalized, more local, might engender some more enthusiasm and a higher electoral turnout?
Is it under the condition of there still being this 5-4 split?
It would be under the condition of possibly 9 elected.
Okay, I think so. Again, we talked about it before. There's no panacea. Like some all elected school boards still have low turnout for all the things that we described. The cost of participating in politics, the ways that people get selected to run for office. So there's a lot of pieces that have to come together for us to get the most ideal form of participation that we want. But I think given you all's particular context and historical, the precedent by which people are participating, the baseline is so low that I would imagine the more direct access could give people, what you want is people to feel like they are going to give you a second chance. You need people to feel like they have a second chance to believe in government again, and the power to participate. And I think that providing direct access to the levers of power can potentially engender that. So I think that is a potential mechanism and pathway, I think.
Thank you.
Commissioner DeJesus.
I think maybe Collins wanted to respond to that as well.
Oh, I apologize.
Just a quick thing too. I totally agree with Sally. I think she's on the nose. And the only thing that I'll add too is that because you have to think about the incentives for mobilization. And that's the real benefit of having the more district-based election structure is you have, if you're a candidate, if you're someone who wants to get into politics, who really, wants to be like a community leader, this kind of arrangement really is tailor-made for you. And the incentives are there for you to go knock door to door, touch base with everyone in your community, and try to drum up as much political interest as you can. If it's when there's an at-large format, it really disadvantages the folks who don't have the means, the capacity, the resources to have a citywide campaign, and then or an effective citywide campaign. But it would be great if they only had to campaign in their own communities. And so I think, having that incentive in place is important, because also, we only really have two levers for mobilization, and it's candidates and it's groups. It's like organized like civic groups. And if the candidates themselves don't have the incentive to knock on doors in their communities, it's really left up to the civic groups. And it depends on the interest of the civic group. We have some civic groups that are really true to the idea of a civic group, where they want public participation, they want public empowerment. We have other civic groups that are kind of in name only, and they're driven by donors, and they don't really care about true civic empowerment. They care about touching specific people. And so having candidates incentivized to touch as many voters in their community as possible is a really big deal. And I think the community, the district structure helps to do that.
Thank you.
Commissioner DeJesus, do you still have a question or comment?
Well, I got a question that someone made me, and I'm going to defer this to the professors, because I think is a decent example, and I can relate to it in a way. So when this charter that we're using currently, with a few amendments, I was, probably coming into high school, my freshman year in high school, and I graduated in 2005. When I graduated, and I'll give you some feedback, and I'll try to get this question answered. In high schoolers, it was 3 out of 10 students were graduating high school. And that was during the system where the politicians, where there was elections. And so since we've changed over to appointed, doesn't provide me a number, but I would have to do some more research on this question. The graduation rate has improved in the past 20 years. Graduation rate has improved. The test scores has improved. So what do you do with that data? In the past 2 years, the school system numbers and graduation numbers and test scores have increased. And with this current structure, how do we transition from that system to going back to a system that people fought for to get people with more consistency? What would you recommend a city like us to do? Should we hire out and figure out what systems work for us? Because we can look across the nation, but we got to look at what works for us in our city. And it is interesting, because I do remember as a student, 3 out of 10, they would tell us there's 100 of you guys here, 30 of you guys are going to graduate. It was alarming. That's really what happened. And so this question, I'm not going to read it in totality, but it does raise that question. What do we do? Because in a way, they painted, I have not done the research to agree with them, but they have that system is showing numbers, and it has showed improvements in the education of our students, maybe not in participation of the parents, but in the educational level and graduation rates. Can you help us out with that?
Sally's written an entire paper about this.
He's just gonna, I don't know which one.
New Orleans study.
Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Well, the first thing that came to my mind was what Medina actually wrote, that, this is certainly a situation. I hear this a lot, actually, where when we had an elected school board, we were failing. That's why the state took over. Now we're doing well. And it's definitely a correlation, doesn't equal causation. So many things have changed. Half of the schools that were bad were closed, or weeded out or replaced by charter schools. Now the things that you need to graduate are different. So many things have changed during that same period of time. That we actually cannot say that the fundamental structure of a board is directly connected to the performance outcomes of students. That direct relationship is just one that if anyone tells you is the case, you should be deeply suspicious, because I don't know of any research that shows that the structure of the board is connected to the statistical outcomes of a student group. There's way too many factors in between. So I just want to be really clear because I hear that often. In the case of the New Orleans work that we did on who governs, NOLA was this interesting place because they had Hurricane Katrina, and it created a situation where a lot of the returning residents, the context shaping the returning residents were very different, right? So you had this place that looked like Hartford, largely African American students, largely African American teachers, a school board structure, and then once Katrina occurred, a situation where the school board was now, a new school board was created to absorb this mostly now charter school board system. And the argument was that the charter schools were doing better by these residents than the previous school board. And that meant that, that was proof or evidence that charter schools are better for these residents. But what we see is these huge racial differences. So for some reason, or a reason I'm going to describe, a lot of the white people who were surveyed basically said, we're doing better, this is a better outcome for us. But all the Black people said, this is actually a worse outcome for us. It actually isn't, they're not doing better by our students. And that's because they were assessing, school data is also political. So they had different measures of how they were thinking about success and progress. And so white people were looking specifically at, for example, they were equating, which we actually see in housing studies too. They were equating the fact that New Orleans was more white and that there were new schools with it being better. That's just how they were associating what was transpiring. Black people noticed that they were losing power and they were associating with things getting worse. And that was end up translating into the way that people were interpreting how schools were actually doing. And a lot of these can go back to what you're measuring. So if crime is up, this is loosely related. For example, I do work on girls. Girls are getting A's, but they have higher experiences with rape and sexual abuse. Is that success? And so when you looked at success measures, they were interpreted differently by various groups, depending on perceptions of what safety was, depending on perceptions of what it meant to do well, depending on what you actually were focusing on. Were you focusing on math competency or were you focusing on comprehension, right? Those kinds of things. And then people would take those politically and use that to connect to what they thought were the actual outcomes. And so I could go on, but I think the biggest thing to take away from this, because this comes up all the time, is that board structure is not dictating the statistical outcomes of students. Board structure is a mechanism. It's a mechanism by which we can help communities get the resources that they need. You guys are tools, ways to help provide resources that are necessary. And the things that actually help students do well are the things we already know, is having those resources and supports in place. And structures can help provide that or facilitate that, but they in themselves don't dictate the outcome. And so I think you're right that you guys have to figure out what structure works best for you given your set of circumstances. And I think some of the ideas that came up today could be things that could be tried because it's obviously been 20 years and it's been a struggle. So I hope that helps a little bit in helping to answer your question.
Yeah, and could I add to that too, just that we don't know that there's any kind of causal relationship between the structure and student performance. And then but let's assume that there was. Let's even like kind of follow this hypothetical scenario and assume that there was. If scores suddenly change and, you know, now you look up in 10 years, students are doing poorly. The problem here now is that when there isn't a democratic infrastructure, how are you going to respond to it? When there's a democratic infrastructure and there's low performance, there's a mechanism to respond to that. You vote people out, you show up at meetings, there's contestation, there's an ability to raise the conflict and hopefully work through the problem. When there is no democratic element, then what do you do? I mean, there's always discussion around, look at how great some of these districts seem to be doing while they're simultaneously sort of de-democratizing themselves. But what if this is just the prologue? And at the end of the movie, we see low test scores, segregated schools, and now we have no mechanism to fix it. And what you're doing as a commission is you're figuring out, how can we actually create that mechanism that is in place in case things are going right or wrong?
And what you're describing, what he's describing is exactly what we've seen in places like New Orleans, as well as a lot of other smaller Newark areas, which Hartford might be more connected to, actually, is sort of the disintegration of democratic mechanisms of accountability, and thus no clear way to do right by communities.
I thank you guys so much, because I couldn't answer that question as adequately as you guys did. So the viewer who's watching it got their response. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner De Jesus. Any other questions for our panelists this evening? Okay. Well, seeing none, thank you both so much. If you don't mind, there are a couple of commissioners who have asked for your contact information, so we may distribute that so they can communicate with you and ask questions afterwards. But really an amazing panel, and we appreciate the time that you both gave to the City of Hartford tonight. And I want to say that on behalf of the commission, on behalf of the residents of Hartford as well. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This was honestly a pleasure to be able to engage with you all on direct impact work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you
much.
All right. So on tonight's agenda, we also had, it was item number 3. It now would be item number 4, a preliminary conversation regarding changes to Chapter 9 of the Charter. And I think the panel discussion went on a little bit longer than we had expected. And I think it would be a little bit of a disservice to start a preliminary conversation about the changes to such a massive topic at 8:48 in the evening tonight. So I'm going to recommend that we table that agenda item and then take up a special meeting at some point in the near future. We can schedule with all of you to have a more robust conversation about everything that we've discussed tonight. So, Attorney Mednick.
Want to just do it at the next meeting?
Yeah, I think that might work too.
Okay.
The only thing I will say though, and I just want to make this clear to the commissioners, we have this schedule that we've laid out, and things wrap up. We'll have gone through the charter and finished things up, all the sections and discussing the various sections and chapters by March 3rd. And that's something that I want to stick closely to so that we have time at the end of that process to really deliberate and have wide-ranging conversations about what it is exactly that we're going to be giving to the city council in May. And so if we get behind, we're going to be scheduling special meetings here and there, because I don't want to get to the point where it's April and we're having these 6-hour meetings on Saturdays because we haven't gotten all of our work done, and we've taken our time. So Commissioner Smith.
I think that if we get behind in the schedule, we can blame Attorney Mednick for bringing such good panelists time and time again. We need to do something about the quality of the panelists that he's bringing.
I know. Come on, Steve.
Sorry.
They have been amazing.
Make him cut his hair.
I just got a haircut today.
All right. Any other comments or questions? All right, commissioners, thank you again for your participation. I appreciate it. And we will see you at our next meeting. And without objection, we stand adjourned at 8:50 p.m. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Attorney Mednick, for a great
Good night.
panelist.
Thank you. Good night.
Great job, guys.
Good night.